This is the Music History In-Depth podcast for March 5th through the 11th. On this week's show, bromance changes music forever. Two artists pass away long before their time, and we discuss how a future music legend broke major world news. In 1994, a bromance was formed over the internet that would eventually transform the music industry, both for the good and the bad. It was in that year that teenagers Sean Fanning and Sean Parker met in an online chat group. They became friends over hacking, programming, theoretical physics, typical kid stuff. As they got older, they got an idea about file sharing over the internet, specifically MP3 files. On June 1st, 1999, they released their file sharing program known as Napster. Within a year, the Windows-based program amassed millions of people who were sharing song files for free. Mac users got an official version in 2000 after a couple of unofficial versions were released by other people, and this might be one of the very few times that a popular program was first on Windows and not on Macintosh. The implications of this program are now obvious, though, as with most things historical, no one really knew it at the time. See, before Napster, if you wanted to get a specific song, you only had maybe 4 ways of getting it. The first was to pray that the record company released the song as a single or the B-side to another single. The other was to buy the entire album, CD, cassette that the song was on. The third way was to hope that the song got played on the radio and that you could record the song on a cassette, provided that the DJ didn't speak most of the way through the song, which happened an awful lot and actually still does to this very day. The fourth way was that you could try to borrow a copy of the album from a friend or the local library and try to record it for yourself. Yes, I know. We also walked 10 miles both ways to school and back with a loose-leaf notebook being chased by polar bears. I get it. What are you going to do? Napster also hit at the absolute perfect time because of an overlooked fact by people who talk about that era a lot. The fact of the matter was that record companies were getting extremely greedy. Greedier than they normally were and still are. Side note, by the way, for all these kids on YouTube making these videos about how you've exposed the music industry for being greedy and corrupt, spoiler alert, the music industry has always been corrupt and greedy. You're not exactly treading new ground here. If it wasn't mob corruption, it was record label and corporate greed and corruption. You're not exposing a damn thing that people haven't known about for well in excess of a couple centuries now. Literally a couple centuries, even going back to classical music days. Anyway, back to the program. The record label jacked up prices so much that it was tough to justify paying for 1 or 2 songs off of an album, especially if the album really sucked. Michael Bolton's album, Time, Love, and Tenderness, was the first to test the greed factor, clocking in at an astounding $18.98 list price for a CD, which, trust me, back in the 90s, that was a lot of money. Vinyl by then had died a miserable death, only to be hipster zombified in the past decade or so. Seriously, Gen Z and millennials, $30 list price for an LP record now? Y'all are crazy for paying that kind of money for an LP record. But again, I digress. Coming back off my porch, going back into my house, gonna take my Geritol. I'll go outside and yell at the clouds again later. Anyway, when faced with a $19 plus tax list price for 1 or 2 songs that you liked off of an album, or getting those songs that someone burned from their CD copy for free off of the internet, you can pretty much figure out which choice most people under the age of 40 went with at that time. Plus, There was a case that the government brought against the record labels for price fixing right around that time, from which the labels said that they were really, really sorry without admitting to anything, and they paid a relatively small fine. Of course, with any new popular technology, you're going to have competition and especially enemies, and Napster certainly found plenty of those. Soon, copycat sites started popping up like LimeWire, Kazaa, Scour, Freenet, etc., etc. And then hackers and others, including record labels, would put songs with viruses encoded into them, spreading malware and such to scare people from using the free programs. And then the music industry really came calling. The first artists were Metallica, who saw that their song I Disappear had leaked onto Napster, and then they saw that their entire catalog was being shared online for free. They sued Napster to get every copy of every song taken down, and then Dr. Dre did the same thing with his music. The problem for the recording industry was profound. For starters, albums would routinely sell at least 1 million copies, or in layman's terms, go platinum. After Napster, that essentially stopped being so routine. I mean, why would a lot of albums sell over 1 million copies if record labels kept putting out an inferior product and you could get that inferior product for free? Second, MP3s officially didn't exist in their eyes. They didn't release them. They had no stores to sell them, and I highly doubt that if you asked a record executive at that time what an MP3 was, they wouldn't have known the answer other than to say that it was hurting their business. iTunes didn't exist yet. In fact, if it wasn't for Steve Jobs putting all of the record label heads into a room and having his now famous ultimatum of, here's what iTunes is, and here's what you're going to do or you'll die meeting, the music industry as we know it would have died a very painful self-inflicted death. I say self-inflicted because of the history of the industry, which is that whenever anything new comes along, they do the following. First, they stick their heads in the sand and pretend that it's not actually hurting them. Then they demonize the new technology and sue whoever put it out or has it, making enemies of the electronics industry and music fans. They did this when the cassette was invented, going after manufacturers of cassette machines, and they did it here. Boy, did they do it here. First, A&M Records filed suit against Napster on the grounds of copyright infringement. The Recording Industry Association of America, that trade group that covers the record labels, ran shotgun on that lawsuit, and then the RIAA went after consumers. They started suing individual people for thousands of dollars who downloaded anything off of Napster and all the other programs. They sued colleges that had computer servers on their campuses that were being used to download from Napster. The entire thing was a PR nightmare for the industry, although the RIAA, Metallica, Dr. Dre, and others did actually have a point. Sorry, but they actually did. They can't make money if they're giving away their music for free. The court system saw it the same way. Napster lost the court case, and on March 6, 2001, Napster started complying with the court order by taking down and blocking songs from being shared, effectively killing their company, at least in the short term. Again, I say short term because Napster as a company isn't dead, still, much like MySpace isn't officially dead. Napster filed for bankruptcy, where its brand and assets were bought and changed hands through a number of companies, everybody from Best Buy to the streaming service Rhapsody. When you think about its match with a streaming service, it kind of makes sense, since Napster was sort of a streaming service, only no one was getting paid royalties off of any of the songs. As far as Sean Fanning and Sean Parker go, well, don't cry and hold a telethon for them, or a GoFundMe for that matter. Fanning has gone on to create many other companies, including Rupture, Path, Snowcap, and Airtime. Parker became a technology investor, starting with a little company at the time called The Facebook at that time. Parker was actually their first president and was the one who got Mark Zuckerberg complete control over Facebook so that he couldn't be kicked out of his own company like Steve Jobs was during his first time at Apple. Parker, by the way, is now worth, last check, about $2.2 billion. Still need to GoFundMe, I'm sure. As far as the recording industry goes, they, of course, finally got on board with MP3s thanks to Steve Jobs, iTunes, and the iPod. It's opened up the playing field for artists like Chance the Rapper to have careers without a major record label deal, so something good did come out of the whole thing. Plus, while Napster killed the album and created a singles culture for musicians, it opened up new technology like streaming services like Spotify to exist, although I'm not a fan of renting my music because an artist will get into a fight with one of those streaming services and pull their music right off of it. And then what do? Oh, and streaming services and putting music videos on YouTube and other places were also things that the music industry first went after until they learned to embrace that technology, and by embrace I mean make money off of it. Watch. They've already started complaining about AI as well, but they'll figure out a way to use AI vocals without having to pay somebody royalties, or maybe create completely AI avatars with AI vocals and then have them do hologram tours. Oh wait, that's already happening. God bless the dinosaurs that are the record labels. The beginning of the end of Napster, as everybody knew it at the time, began on March 6th, 2001. Before we continue, we'd like to tell you about the Music History Today podcast, where we go over the events that happened on that particular day in music history. The Music History Today podcast drops every single day, including weekends, on this podcast network. Now, back to the Music History In-Depth podcast. Now, on to two artists whose lives were cut way too short, long before their time. First, no one knew it at the time, but a young woman who was on television the night of January 21st, 1957, would go on to become a country music icon, and it took a reality TV show to do it. Back in the 1940s and 50s, Arthur Godfrey was the Dick Clark, or Ryan Seacrest these days, of television. He had a bunch of shows, both on radio and television, and was a household name. One of his shows was called Arthur Godfrey's Talent Scouts, where amateur entertainers would get their big break. It was a contest show. People would go on, do their performances, and the audience would pick the winner. Think of it as American Idol or Star Search before there was such a thing. In order to be on the show, you had to first audition. Some people who were deemed not worthy to be on the show included Buddy Holly and Elvis Presley. Go figure. That does not, however, detract from the show's track record. Their list of soon-to-be stars who got their start on the show include Tony Bennett, Pat Boone, Lenny Bruce, the comedian, and Marilyn Horne. On January 21st, 1957, a young woman from Winchester, Virginia, went on the show and performed the song Walking After Midnight. She won the contest that night. And that was when the world first heard of Patsy Cline. Patsy was born Virginia Patterson Hensley on September 8, 1932 in Winchester, Virginia. She started out singing locally in Virginia at the age of 15. She married her first husband, Gerald Cline, in 1953 and was signed to the Four Star record label in 1954. Over the next couple of years, Patsy had a couple of small hits, 1955's A Church, a Courtroom, Then Goodbye, and 1956's I've Loved and Lost Again, but not much more. In 1957, she performed nationally on Arthur Godfrey's Talent Scouts, and after that, her life changed. In 1957, Patsy divorced Gerald Cline, but kept his last name for working purposes. She then got married to Charlie Dick later in the year, and in 1958 they had a child. She moved to Nashville in 1958 to further her career. She found new management, became a member of the Grand Ole Opry, and then signed to Decca Records. Patsy had a serious car accident in 1961, which took her about 6 months to recover from. Patsy would go on to have a lot of hits from 1960 to 1963, including this next classic, the song Crazy, which was written by country music legend Willie Nelson, although he wasn't a legend at that point. He was just a songwriter. When Patsy Cline's husband first brought the song to her attention, he reportedly said, quote, "The song's crazy," end quote, to which Patsy reportedly said, quote, "It certainly is," end quote. Guess she wasn't such a big fan of the original version. To be fair, though, Willie's demo track had him speaking the words instead of singing them. Patsy gave it a chance anyway, recorded the song on August 21st, 1961, and released it on October 16th, 1961. The song became a huge hit, going to number 2 on the Billboard country charts and top 10 on the pop singles chart. Aside from Crazy, Patsy had hits like the aforementioned Walking After Midnight, which became a big hit after she was on that show, I Fall to Pieces, When I Get Through With You, Leaving on My Mind, So Wrong, and She's Got You. In early 1963, Kansas City, Kansas DJ Cactus Jack Call was killed in a car accident. On March 3rd, 1963, 3 benefit concerts were held for his family. The concerts were stacked with soon-to-be country music legends. George Jones performed, as did Billy Walker, Dottie West, Cowboy Copas, along with Hawkshaw Hawkins of the group Ozark Jubilee. Patsy, who was sick that day, still performed all 3 shows, then went to the Townhouse Motor Hotel to rest up for the night for a flight out of Fairfax Airport back to Nashville the very next day. Unfortunately, March 4th was a very foggy day in the area, and the airport was fogged in. Dottie West, who was making the 8-hour drive back to Nashville with her husband, asked Patsy if she wanted a ride. And here is where history eerily repeated itself. Flashback to the night on February 3rd, 1959, at the Surf Ballroom in Clear Lake, Iowa. J.P., the Big Bopper Richardson, asked a young Waylon Jennings if he could take Jennings' seat on a Beechcraft 35 Bonanza plane instead of the freezing bus that their tour was supposed to take to their next stop in Fargo, North Dakota. Jennings said yes. When fellow tourmate Buddy Holly found out about it, he good-naturedly kidded with Jennings, saying, quote, "I hope your old bus freezes up," end quote, to which Jennings kidded back, quote, "Well, I hope your old plane crashes," end quote. That phrase haunted Jennings for the rest of his life, as the plane that had the Big Bopper, Buddy Holly, Richie Valens, and their pilot crashed only a few hours after that remark, killing all on board. That crash became immortalized, of course, in Don McLean's classic song American Pie as the day the music died. Fast forward now to 1963. Patsy Cline's response to Dottie West's offer of a ride in the car, quote, "Don't worry about me, hoss. When it's my time to go, it's my time," end quote. It's always been one of those flippant remarks that people always say when they talk about death, thinking that their time really isn't going to be anytime soon, and that they'll feel content if they are blessed to know that their time is near. I'm not sure if Dottie was haunted by that remark for the rest of her life, but I sure would have been. It's also why I never say that phrase, because I know that no matter when that time comes, and hopefully no, it's not going to be very soon, I will always have one more idea that I want to try or one more thing I want to do. It's how my creative mind works. This isn't about me, though. This is about Patsy, so let's get back to her. Patsy stayed another night at the motel, then called her mom around noon on March 5th, and then checked out of the hotel and went to the airport. She got into a Piper PA-24 Comanche airplane, piloted by Randy Hughes. Also on the plane were Cowboy Copas and Hawkshaw Hawkins. Billy Walker was supposed to be on that plane. However, he had to take a commercial jet back home because someone in his family had gotten sick. So Hawkins took his place, in yet another eerie nod to the whole Buddy Holly crash. The plane left, made a stop in Rogers, Arkansas to refuel, and then flew to Dyersburg, Tennessee, and landed at 5 p.m. Weather had gotten pretty bad, so the airport manager offered the passengers and the pilot free rooms for the night and told them that they should fly out in the morning. The weather was cold and very windy, with cloud cover being low at about 500 feet. Not exactly prime weather conditions for flying in a rather hilly area in a small plane. The pilot, Randy Hughes, said, quote, "I've already come this far. We'll be there before you know it," end quote, as they were literally only a couple hours flight out of Nashville. Hughes, by the way, did not know how to do any instrument flying in bad weather, in yet another eerie nod to the Buddy Holly crashes. Their pilot did not know how to fly in bad weather either. He had told the manager that he was familiar with the terrain and would fly back to the airport if he felt that he couldn't make it. The plane, with everybody on board, left for Nashville at 6:07 p.m. in bad weather. When the plane didn't land in Nashville, people became worried. People called around and started searching for the plane. Among the people who searched was soon-to-be country music legend Roger Miller of King of the Road fame. It was he and his group of friends who found the wreckage of the plane in Camden, Tennessee, about 90 miles outside of Nashville. All on board were killed instantly. When they found Patsy's watch, it said 6:20 p.m., which was probably the moment of impact, although some reports have the crash at 6:29 p.m. That wristwatch, by the way, along with a few other items from the crash site, were donated to the Country Music Hall of Fame and Museum in Nashville, Tennessee. And some were also donated to the Patsy Cline Museum, which isn't actually too far away from the Country Music Hall of Fame and Museum in Nashville. Patsy was buried in her hometown of Winchester, Virginia. Patsy's voice and style still inspire many singers to this very day, including Reba McEntire and LeAnn Rimes. Patsy was also a pioneer for women trying to make it into country music in the early 1960s. She is on Rolling Stone magazine's list of 100 greatest singers and is a member of the Country Music Hall of Fame. She's also been the subject of many movies. Her famous friendship with country music legend Loretta Lynn has been portrayed in the Loretta Lynn biopic Coal Miner's Daughter, where she was played at the time by Beverly D'Angelo. Jessica Lange played Cline in Cline's 1985 biopic Sweet Dreams, for which Lange received a Best Actress nomination at the Academy Awards. Cline's various friendships with other famous people, including Dottie West, have been portrayed in other movies, TV shows, theater productions, and documentaries. Patsy remains one of country music's most beloved performers. The tragic, untimely death of country music icon Patsy Cline, along with Cowboy Copas and Hawkshaw Hawkins in a small plane crash on March 5th, 1963. This next artist's story is an all-too-familiar one about immense talent that was squandered by demons of one sort or another. Those of you of a certain age no doubt have heard of the brothers Gibb, a.k.a. Barry, Robin, and Maurice Gibb, better known as the Bee Gees. Their history you probably know, and their songs you definitely know. They were listed as one of the greatest groups of all time. Their soundtrack to Saturday Night Fever is still one of the best-selling albums of all time and helped to usher in the disco era into mainstream America. Plus, they were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. What you may not remember is that for a brief few years, there was another member of the Gibb family who had a career that rivaled even the Bee Gees' popularity. Andy Gibb was born on March 5, 1958. From the time he was 10 years old, he was in his famous older brother's shadows. When he was a teenager, he decided he wanted to get into the family business. He tried to get a band together in both England and Australia, with his brothers helping him out on songwriting and playing background instruments. Nothing caught on until Robert Stigwood heard some of his demo tracks. Stigwood was the owner of record label RSO and was also the manager of the Bee Gees. Stigwood listened, liked what he heard, and signed Gibb to a record deal. Gibb got to work writing songs with his brothers helping out. He started out hot right out of the gate. His first 3 released singles each went to number 1 on the Billboard singles chart, making him the first male solo artist to accomplish that feat. I Just Want to Be Your Everything, Love Is Thicker Than Water, and Shadow Dancing made his albums into multi-platinum sellers and turned Andy into an international superstar at the same time that his brothers were megastars. He parlayed that success into hosting gigs on the television show Solid Gold and also on Broadway on Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat Broadway musical. While Andy wanted all this fame and adoration, he kind of forgot that fame comes at a cost sometimes. The first rule is that if you live by the trend, then you're going to die by the trend. When Andy broke out, disco was already well into its height of popularity and was beginning its downward spiral, although no one knew it at the time. Also, Andy had always lived in his brother's shadows. He figured that once he had a big career, that would change. It didn't, unfortunately. Some of his detractors kept pointing out that if it wasn't for his last name and his brothers helping to write his songs, he never would have gotten that recording contract in the first place. The thing was that even though his brothers were co-writers on his songs, Andy did help out a lot with all of his songs and was a really good songwriter in his own right. He would never get as much credit as he deserved and would forever be known as the Bee Gees' baby brother, which made him feel pretty insecure, and you can understand why. That insecurity, unfortunately, helped to lead to bouts of depression. It would also lead to drug problems, really serious drug problems. Andy's drug was the sexy drug of choice for rich people at that time, cocaine. His drug binges were such that he would go missing for days at a time. Eventually, drugs would cost him everything. Drugs cost Andy his recording contract, as RSO cut him once his contract ran out. Drugs cost him his hosting gig on Solid Gold and also his role in Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, as he was usually missing from his shows. Drugs cost him his relationship with the hot sex symbol actress at that moment, Victoria Principal, of the uber-popular TV show Dallas, as Andy literally chose drugs over Victoria when Victoria gave him an ultimatum of choosing between her and his drug habit. Andy was in and out of rehab throughout most of the 1980s. In 1987, he went bankrupt with only $8,000 to his name after amassing millions during his heyday. Finally, in 1988, Andy seemed to be doing pretty well and was sober. He started work on getting a comeback going, and he started working on new songs, which brought him a lot of joy. On March 5th, 1988, Andy Gibb celebrated his 30th birthday. On March 7th, only 2 days after his birthday, Andy complained of chest and abdominal pains and was sent to the hospital. On the morning of March 10th, the doctor in the hospital told him that he would need more tests to determine how to proceed. He wouldn't get the chance to do those tests. Andy Gibb passed away later that day in the hospital from heart inflammation brought on by a viral infection. The cocaine habit had taken its toll. Years of ravaging his body with cocaine made his heart muscles so weak so that when the virus came along, his heart wasn't strong enough to protect itself. Between 1977 and 1980, Andy Gibb released 3 albums. His first 2 albums, 1977's Flowing Rivers and 1978's Shadow Dancing, both hit platinum, while his 1980 album, After Dark, went gold. He also had 6 songs that went top 10. I Just Want to Be Your Everything, Love Is Thicker Than Water, and Shadow Dancing all hit number 1, Desire hit number 4, and Everlasting Love hit number 5, and Our Love, Don't Throw It All Away hit number 9. The sad part to all of this is that Andy had the talent to be an even bigger star. He could have easily have survived the decline of disco, except that drugs took over and crushed his career, and eventually indirectly led to his untimely death at the age of 30. A flame that burned brightly for way too short an amount of time. The Life and Times of Andy Gibb, March 5th, 1958 to March 10th, 1988. Before we get to our final story, there is an honorable mention. On March 9th, 1997, an artist who was just beginning to make his presence known to the world was taken from this earth. Christopher Wallace, a.k.a. Big Papa, Biggie, the notorious B.I.G., was gunned down in a car in Los Angeles, California, bringing an unofficial end to the East Coast-West Coast feud that also cost the life of Tupac Shakur only a year earlier. While he was popular while he was alive, he became even bigger in death and is now considered either the greatest or second greatest rapper of all time, depending on which side of the East Coast-West Coast rivalry you actually sit on. In the early to middle part of the 20th century, there was a towering leader on the world stage. His name was Joseph Stalin. At one time, he edited the Russian newspaper Pravda and was one of the leaders of the Bolshevik Revolution that helped to take down the Tsars of Russia. He helped form the Soviet Union in 1922 under its first leader, Vladimir Lenin, who he had met at a conference in 1905. Lenin didn't trust Stalin too much and didn't want him succeeding him upon his death. Despite all that, though, Stalin did by consolidating power, the old-fashioned way. Imprisoning and killing people who he thought were, quote, enemies of the state, end quote. All this sounds awfully familiar. Those enemies included the press, military leaders, business people, intellectuals, political leaders, government institutions, etc. Boy, is this sounding awfully familiar. In short, he had hundreds of thousands of his own people killed in a 5-year time span known as the Great Purge. All this happened before World War II, when he first sided with the Nazis and then switched sides once Hitler and the Nazis invaded Russia. Go figure. Funny how that works. At that point, the Allied powers of the United States, Canada, and England et al. Decided to overlook Stalin's little inhumane acts, taking a, quote, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, quote, approach to Stalin, and with Russia squeezing from the east and America, Canada, England, and other Allied forces squeezing from the west and also in Africa, Hitler was eventually defeated. What happened in the years after World War II was the start of the Cold War. Stalin and his brand of communism, known as Stalinism, ruled with an iron fist. Winston Churchill warned of what was happening in his now famous Iron Curtain speech. The United States and Russia pushed their interests worldwide, with the Soviet Union now including countries that it took over after World War II. Russia was now also armed with nuclear weapons, which raised the stakes tremendously. Stalin also effectively closed off communications with the West so that no one knew what was going on in Russia. You didn't even know if someone died. In fact, the only way to know what was going on was if you intercepted communications or had notes passed through spy networks. And it was through the interception of communications that the non-communist Western world found out on March 5th, 1953, that Joseph Stalin had indeed passed away. And here is where this little history lesson on Stalin and communism gets its musical connection and thus ends up in this podcast. A man enlisted in the United States Air Force on July 7th, 1950. He was eventually stationed in Landsberg, Germany, in the 12th Radio Squadron Mobile of the Air Force Security Service. It was one of the many places where the United States had operations set up to intercept messages from the Soviet Union. As a Morse code operator, this man's job was to intercept and decode the messages going throughout the Soviet Union, and he was extremely good at it. On March 5th, 1953, he intercepted a message given to Soviet Union Army officials. He helped to decode it, and that is how the White House, President Dwight D. Eisenhower, and the United States people found out that Joseph Stalin had passed away. This man was eventually honorably discharged from military service on July 3rd, 1954. He eventually moved to Memphis, Tennessee, where he sold appliances. He was originally going to become a radio announcer, but he had a love for playing music. He auditioned for Sam Phillips at Sun Records, where he started recording. He went on to have a legendary career. He is one of the biggest selling artists of all time. His crossover appeal is such that he's been inducted into the Rock and Roll, Gospel, and Country Music Halls of Fame. And if you're thinking that I'm talking about Elvis Presley, you are about a decade too late, because Elvis didn't get into the armed services until early 1960s, 58, 59, 60, somewhere thereabouts. Nope. This man, who is a legend, who is also the man who intercepted the Morse code message that Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin was dead, none other than the Man in Black, country music legend, and United States Air Force Staff Sergeant Johnny Cash, who helped to decode the message that Soviet Union leader Joseph Stalin had passed away on March 5th, 1953. And that is it for the Music History In-Depth podcast for March 5th through the 11th. Thank you very much for listening and or watching if you're on YouTube or Spotify.